Hello, welcome to Jewish Museum Milwaukee's Museum Moments. Today, we are joined by my colleague, Samantha Goldberg from the Nathan and Esther Pelz Holocaust Education Resource Center. Because today is this week marks the 75th anniversary of the executions following the Nuremberg Trials. So we thought it would be an interesting time to explore some of the collections we have about the Nuremberg Trials, but also to look at the lasting legacy of the Nuremberg Trials. Before I turn it over to Sam, I just want to introduce this rather strange piece that we have in the museum. It's a series of framed autographs and pictures that were collected by a serviceman. I believe his name was Ernie Sandroni, who was at Nuremberg. And they're of all of the people who were on trial, or not all of them, but a good portion of them. And we've had this in our collection for a while. It was one of these things that Mr. Sandroni felt like it needed to be somewhere. He didn't know what to do with it after he collected it. And it was in his house for many, many years. It's kind of a strange collection altogether, but it shows you this kind of weird state that people were in around the Nuremberg trials. These people are criminals, but what's their role? How does this look? Sam, can you take us through some of the mechanics of what the Nuremberg trials were like?
Absolutely. So the Nuremberg Trials, as many of you may have guessed, were the trials following the Holocaust. So interesting enough, this picture that Ellie described to me, now we're seeing here, is who we see and who we don't see. But first, I'm just going to go over a little bit, I guess, of an overview. So there were a lot of high-ranking officials, those that did not escape or committed suicide before the trials. They were tried in this international court. So this was actually the first time that individuals were going to be held accountable for international crimes or crimes that their government committed. So that was a huge thing, and that's kind of, we're going to dive into the lasting legacies later. But there was a total of 199 defendants tried at Nuremberg, with 161 that were convicted and 37 that were sentenced to death. So, and there was also additional trials that were held for other high government officials, military SS, that were outside of Nuremberg, and namely the Eichmann trial, which is very well publicized, that happened later on as well. So there were trials that kind of followed Nuremberg that kind of continued on with this, the trials following the Holocaust.
How did they determine who was eligible for the death penalty versus who was just kind of a normal Nazi, I would say?
That's a great question, and a lot of it was just based on like who was orchestrating it. So some of the high-ranking officials that were really kind of like the puppet masters, they got more of the death sentences, whereas people that ran the camps, that were helping in little pieces that helped to orchestrate the Holocaust, got lesser sentences. And there were a few acquittals as well, of people that escaped any kind of persecution.
And as we're kind of thinking about this, I know that the Nuremberg trial was the first moment in which kind of all of the evidence of the Holocaust starts being developed. It's my understanding that it's over 16 miles of documentation, paper documentation, that people were sorting through. What was that process like? Where were they getting the information? How are they pulling this all together?
Well, the Holocaust, many people will refer to as one of the most well-documented instances of genocide because they kept meticulous records. They had a lot of forms that said, like, this is how many orders of Zyklon B we need. This is how many people entered the camps. This is how many people were eligible for work. This many children and women were gassed. It was meticulous. So they were able to collect this from the camps and the killing centers that were abandoned when the SS were losing the war, or when Germany was losing the war and SS were fleeing on death marches, or just trying to kind of like leave this crime space. But there was a lot left behind because they were kind of in a hurry and leaving. So they destroyed a lot, but there was still a lot that was collected. And as we're talking about, kind of alluded to in the beginning about who was not in this picture you showed, there were a lot of people, Adolf Hitler, Joseph Goebbels, that committed suicide, and also destroying documents as well, like kind of there. And there was never a written order from from Hitler to commit genocide in the Holocaust, but all of the other supporting documentation kind of proves that intention of mass murder. But when we're talking about intention and the trials in general, what I always find interesting is the defense. So what were the defenses of the people that were on trial? Even like if you're watching crime shows now, there's always the defense, even though you know the person's guilty, but there's some sort of defense. And most people will maybe assume that they plead like the insanity defense, but that was definitely not the case. They did what I called the cog in the machine defense, basically stating that, well, they were just a cog in the machine. They didn't really do anything. It wasn't their idea. They were just following orders. And that was supposed to kind of take away the responsibility of all of the millions of people that were killed based on these actions of all of these people following orders. So some of you may have heard of the Milgram Experiment. Ellie, are you familiar?
I am, yeah.
Yeah, so the Milgram Experiment was meant to show that ordinary people can commit violence against one another when being prompted by a person of authority. So this was a man in a white lab coat telling people to like hit a buzzer that was sending a shock to someone in another room. The shock wasn't actually happening. People weren't actually getting hurt, but there was an actor on the other side that was pretending to get hurt, and they were increasing the shock. And there was the man in the white lab coat prompting them, saying, keep doing it, until someone had actually kept hitting the buzzer until the person was presumed dead on the other side of the room. So what this was showing, although moral questions about this experiment have surfaced, obviously, even though no one was hurt, the psychological repercussions of that. But it basically was there to show that ordinary people could inflict pain on one another to the point of killing this other person when the person in the white lab coat, the person of authority, was telling them and prompting them to do so, and also taking that responsibility. Like you hear participants saying, well, if this guy dies or gets seriously injured, like, are you going to be taking the blame for that? And they say yes. And so when you look at that in the frame of the Holocaust, that's what a lot of the defendants were giving as their cog in the machine. Like, I was following orders. I was just doing.
I was just pushing the button. I wasn't the guy in the lab coat.
Exactly. So the guys in the lab coat were the ones that fled, the ones that committed suicide. There were a few of them that were executed, but those were the big players. Those were the Eichmann, the Joseph Goebbels, the Adolf Hitler. Those were the guys in the lab coat. I mean, many more, like the high-ranking officials could also be that guy, but it was so well orchestrated that people were just, oh, well, I was following orders from this person, who's following orders from this person, who's taking orders from this person, really taking the responsibility off of themselves.
In terms of just kind of the international climate at the time, was this seen as, did people get a sense of peace from this, or was it because the big name players weren't there? Was it just kind of outside of the bounds of, yeah, this has to happen, but it doesn't feel like we're getting any kind of sense of closure from it? Is there?
It's hard to say. Honestly, I think that a lot of people were disappointed that some of these big players committed suicide rather than facing their crimes, for sure. And obviously a lot of players fled and had to be caught later. But what's also interesting, especially in the Eichmann trial that we see, there was a lot of testimony, and in Nuremberg, a lot of testimony from victims. And I think that also gave a bit of closure, because they were able to share their stories about what happened and say that man did it, and know that that person was going to be persecuted for the crimes that they committed. So I think that in some way, yes, some ways, no. They got to share their story in this big forum, which I mean was incredibly difficult for them for sure. But that sense that they're helping play a role in this injustice being done. Again, it's kind of hard. And also, I know we mentioned about lasting legacies. I feel like
let's get
jumping
into
a little bit, but it's also interesting to know like what they were tried for. It wasn't genocide. They were tried for like crimes against humanity and war crimes. Again, probably the first instance of individuals being tried for something like that. That was really like an international offense, but not tried for genocide. And that's because the word didn't exist yet. So Raphael Lemkin, who was trying to get this word really kind of ratified way early on, he was looking at the just in Armenia and what was happening in Germany in the Holocaust, eventually kind of won over this term and say that this is a crime, the crime against genocide. Why is it a bigger punishment to kill one person than it is to kill millions? So that was the question he was asking. So in 1948, they had the Convention for the Punishment and Prevention of Genocide. So that was made as an international crime in 1948. So that was obviously like 2 years after the Nuremberg Trials. So that none of them were tried for the crime of genocide because of that. So that's kind of one of the lasting legacies of Nuremberg, is that they were seeing all of these people, they were seeing what the world was capable of, and yet there was not a crime that could fit what was happening. Like they could not.
It wasn't even a term to define what was happening at that.
Yeah, exactly. It was so unthinkable that they could not define it really until later. So that is one of the lasting legacies, is that this new term, this new crime was created.
In terms of what we see today when we talk about war crimes tribunals or truth and reconciliation, do you feel like there are things that are direct correlations between, say, Nuremberg and what we see in, I don't know, Bosnia and The Hague, or, you know, the discussions after the fall of apartheid in South Africa and the way in which governments respond to crimes against humanity in these spaces?
Absolutely. I think Nuremberg was one of the first instances, and then these other trials are definitely kind of mirrored it in the way that you have an international court, because how does a government kind of put themselves on trial for these sort of instances of violence? So absolutely, I think that when we talk about testimonies, the way that Nuremberg and the Eichmann trial used testimonies of victims to help kind of put these people to justice, as well as like, and you look at the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, those are all heavily focused on victims giving their testimonies and being able to put a face to the crime that was committed against them, which again is was also quite a shock, is that some people, when they were met with Eichmann or some of these big high-ranking officials, they didn't know the faces. They weren't the people in the camps with them, putting a face and seeing that evil had a face and that it was very ordinary. Also quite shocking.
So I want to thank you for joining me and helping explore this topic. The Holocaust Education Resource Center is a fabulous resource within our community for Holocaust education. And one of the things when we talk about testimony and survivors telling their stories, it's one of the things that your organization has done for decades, is ensuring that Holocaust survivors have places and ways to share their stories with the broad community. So thank you so much for what you do. And thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.